We are here with Frederic Laloux, the author of Reinventing Organizations, and someone who's been thinking about work and organizational development for a long time. The first interesting thing that I wanted to explore with you is this concept of soulful organizations and rethinking organizations and what that actually means, because I think it's like a beautiful kernel of an idea. So over to you.
Yeah, I really want to stress this point that the very basis of our management system, like the way we think about management today, is outdated, is broken, is no longer fit for our times. And so much of what we talk about in terms of management innovation, and I think in sort of, the new technology and automation and AI and robotics and, virtual reality and all of these things are basically attempts to optimize a broken system, to try to squeeze out 5%, 10% more efficiency out of a system that's fundamentally broken. And many of us sense that and feel that, so many of us dread going to work. And what I've been exploring is a number of organizations that operate just based on a whole different perspective, a whole different worldview. They've been founded by leaders who basically said, actually, that whole management edifice, that whole way we think about how we should structure and run an organization feels outdated to me. And I want to create very different foundations. And maybe that's a bit of a contrarian perspective in this space of biohacking. It doesn't have to do very much with technology at all. It is actually going back to much simpler, healthier ways of how we show up as human beings when we come together. And so what I think is interesting is talking about not so much about the surface elements, these technologies, but talk about the very foundations that we rarely question. And one way to phrase that one of these organizations that I researched does beautifully, they talk about this distinction between a complicated and a complex system. Right, and most of us see the world as a complicated system. Complicated system is something in their analogy, they talk about an airplane, a Boeing or an Airbus. Is a complicated system. It has hundreds of thousands of parts, but it all responds to a sort of linear logic. And take out one part at random, and a clever engineer is going to tell you whether that plane can still fly or what will happen to it, because you can predict everything. Mm-hmm. And then you take a bowl of spaghetti. And the bowl of spaghetti is a complex system, not a complicated system. It only has 40 parts in it, not 100,000. But try pulling at one end, and no computer can tell you, no supercomputer can tell you what will happen. Mm-hmm. Because the system is complex. Mm-hmm. And our whole way of managing our organizations is by believing that there are these complicated things that a few clever people at the top can understand. Right, and we have these beautiful pyramids, and a few people at the top can understand that whole system, can make clever decisions for that whole system. And that system, we believe then we can optimize it with AI and automation and all sorts of things. And actually, our organizations are more like this bowl of spaghetti. They're incredibly complex systems that take a whole different management approach. And so that is the fundamental shift that we need to do. Another way to say the same thing is we can look at organizations as a complex machine, or we can look at organizations as a living system. Mm-hmm. And when you make that switch, everything changes, right? The way we structure organizations, the way we run them, the way we do budgets, the way we do strategy, all of that shifts. And then you don't optimize for 5 or 10%, but you suddenly get to a whole other world of possibilities. And if you're interested, I can share a number of examples of organizations that by doing this leap just end up playing a whole different game. Please. And that to me feels much more interesting than this optimizing, a broken, outdated system. And
one metaphor for that which comes to mind is, people are cutting down trees in a forest.
Yeah.
And most people are talking about increasing the efficiency of cutting down those trees. How many trees per minute?
Exactly.
You're talking about, are you in the right forest to begin with?
Yes.
Perhaps.
Do we even need to cut them down?
Okay. Do you need to cut down the trees? Okay. So, and that's the foundation of your work. I mean, that's, rethinking organizations. That is the foundation. So, but do you want to go to the examples, or do you want to talk about soulful organizations first?
Yeah, just to give you an example, like, one of the most spectacular examples I cover in my research in my book is this company in the Netherlands called Buurtzorg, and they do neighborhood nursing care. So it's nurses that don't work in a hospital but go to people's homes to take care of older people, of people who've had an accident or have chronic conditions that keep them in their home. And this organization was founded only 10 years ago, but it has almost replaced all existing organizations because they're so much superior in every possible way. Right? They now have a market share, I don't know what the latest stages, but probably 70, 80%. They went from 0 to 70, 80%. They've been voted best employer of the Netherlands every single year because people just love working there. People love working with them. They're radically more efficient than any existing organization. And yet, they don't have a single manager. 14,000 people, not a single manager. There's no middle management. There's no power hierarchy, right? And that just blows your mind. How can you have such an incredibly efficient organization that people love to work for, best employer, 14,000 people, and what, not a manager? And that's the kind of leap that we're talking about. Now you can optimize by using AI to identify who are your best managers and to identify, how do we optimize the process by which we elevate people in the hierarchy. Or you can simply make a leap where you say, like, let's revisit that whole model and create a model where we don't have any of these levels of bureaucracy and hierarchy.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the concept of coming back to first principles, how Elon Musk kind of went ahead with Tesla and was like, do we really need this kind of mechanical subsystem? So how did that? How does that work actually? So what is the DNA that allows them to do that?
Yeah, I love this question of first principle, and we often apply it to technology, but we don't often apply it to management. For some reason, we believe that the way we show up at work, the way we collaborate, that there's only basically one way to do it.
With management and hierarchy and autocracy,
all of those things. Yeah. Right? Even though we've known for years that there's different ways to do it. In the 1960s, there was a book that was very famous by somebody called McGregor, and he had this perspective, talking about first principles, that you can look at people. One way to look at them is to say, well, people fundamentally are kind of lazy, are only somewhat honest and don't really like to work, right? And they need to be controlled and need to be, because otherwise, everybody's going to slack off, let's be honest, right?
Yeah.
That's one way to look at things. Another way to look at things is to say, no, people fundamentally are self-motivated. Like, if you come to work, you want to do something that feels useful, that feels productive, where you feel valued. And we just need to create the conditions to do that, and then we can trust them to run with it. Now, which one of those first principles is true? And one of the amazing insights of McGregor is actually both of them are true, depending on the system you create. If you start by believing that people can't be trusted, and you put in all sorts of control mechanisms and sign-off mechanisms and handbooks and all sorts of things, well, I'll hate the system so much that I will try to game that system.
Yeah.
Right? Because I feel, talked to as a kid. Or create a system in which I'm trusted, in which other people are trusted, in which, my value comes from how much I help other people. And of course, I will start to play that game, and I won't need to be controlled. So both of them are true. The thing is simply that right now we have 99% of organizations that operate from this controlling perspective, right? Including Elon Musk's, Tesla. Their management system still operates from that perspective, right? Nice. And we have 1%, but it's growing very fast, of organizations who've just taken this whole different perspective.
And that
the interesting.
It's a very relevant thing right now, considering the work from home and people are having to release some grip on having their bums in the seats and everything. But like, what that reminds me of is that experiment with the teachers and the students. And the teachers were told that the students were gifted. You know that one?
Yes,
And
it's
that
one of the most
resulted in the
famous studies in social sciences, the Rosenthal study, right, or the Pygmalion effect.
Yeah, whatever you tell them, it's gonna be true. So if you give the authority and you give the autonomy and you give the freedom, you will get authenticity and whatever back in return, and that kind of behavior. So that's that's a kind of organizational hack, if you will.
Yeah. So this was an old study that was done in the 1950s. Today it would be considered unethical, but they gave teachers at the beginning of the year some information about students from last year. And for some students, randomly, they added a little piece of paper saying, like, this student is super gifted. And for some other students, randomly, they added a piece of paper saying, like, this student is terrible. And it was just random. But just that little piece of paper made dramatic differences in outcome. Because teachers oriented themselves like, oh, that student is super gifted, but he didn't understand it. So I must have done something wrong in the way I explained it. So I must explain it again. And you help that student. Whereas they would give up on students that apparently, were supposedly not very good. Yeah. So we reap what we saw. And the same is true for management systems.
Yeah, and so the takeaway from this here is that if you can look at any opportunity to build these kinds of principles, freedoms, or coming back to the soulful word, maybe you'd like to explore that one a bit.
Yeah, that piece has to do with the fact that the way we show up in so many organizations is usually transactional, very superficial, right? In most organizations, we feel that for some reason we have to show up behind a professional mask, right? We have to show up in a way that is different from the way we show up with our very best friends when we let the guard down. Mm-hmm. Because we feel that, the work environment isn't entirely safe. And if I were to show up with all of who I am, all of my passions, my quirks, my creativity, the things I really care about, I would make myself vulnerable. That could ultimately be used against me. So it's actually much safer to show up with a sort of professional persona.
With the mask.
With a sort of mask.
Yeah.
And it's sad, and I think if so many organizations feel somewhat lifeless, it has to do with the fact that we show up with very little life ourselves. There's, I think, something deep inside of us, often unconscious, that feels cheated by the superficiality of the way we interact with each other. And we're actually longing for more. And the interesting thing in some of these organizations that I researched is they took, again, sort of the whole different perspective, where they realized, like, if people only show up with a fraction of who they are, it also means they only show up with a fraction of their energy, their passion, and their creativity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so they put in place very dedicated practices and processes to make it feel safe enough for people to really show up with all of who they are. And what happens then is a level of vibrancy that is extraordinary, right? Where people know each other's deep stories, help each other in very deep ways, show up for each other, support each other, and where a lot of the, these petty ego fights, a lot of these petty politics that is played out in so many organizations drains away. Like, if I know so much more about who you are, about your deep stories, like, I cannot hate somebody that I know deeply, right? It's just impossible. It just brings us all to act from a more beautiful place. And again, the vibrancy that then happens is really quite extraordinary.
Nice. Okay, so that's a little bit of color on the soulful organization concept. Now, I want to dive into your pillars, which I understood as being self-management, wholeness, and an evolutionary purpose. Could you speak to those?
Yeah, I mean, the starting point is sort of this historical perspective that every time we went from one historical era and made a leap to another one, right? Say, from a tribal age to an agricultural age, right? From an agricultural age to the industrial age, from the industrial age to the information age. Every time we've made sort of this major transitions.
Well, what do you call the next stage?
Oh, I don't care. Like, there hasn't not been a word. Some people call it sort of the integral age. Some people call it the authentic age. Yeah.
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Every time we make these major leaps, we also have major breakthroughs in the way we come together at work, major management breakthroughs, right? So for instance, when we went from sort of hunter-gatherers to the agricultural age, that's when we invented fixed hierarchies. That's when we invented the org chart. That's when we invented, processes, stable processes that we replicate, right? And when we went from the agrarian age to the industrial age, right, that's when we invented stuff like HR and marketing. And so I've been looking at, as we're going from the information age to this new age, whatever we want to call it, what are the breakthroughs? And there's enough of these new organizations out there for us to actually know what these breakthroughs are. And I believe there are three of them, the ones that you cited. The first is self-management. So this really radical shift where you can now have an organization like Buurtzorg in the Netherlands with 14,000 people and not a single manager.
It's in the DNA.
It's in the DNA, it's in the very structures of this organization. And it takes a while to wrap our head around it because we've all grown up with this idea that, hey, in any large group, you need hierarchy, right? Otherwise, it's chaos, right? We believe that otherwise, the thing will just break down. And the truth is that, yes, we need structure, but we don't need a power hierarchy. We don't need anyone being the boss over anyone else. There's actually structures that allow for this to happen and to be actually much, much more productive and much, much more fulfilling than a traditional power hierarchy, right? And again, we kind of know what this is. We know what these structures look like. We know how you make decisions in these structures, how to deal with conflict in these. So there's enough of these self-managing organizations out there for us to actually know how this works. It's no longer a mystery. It's just that we need to wrap our head around it because at first all of us will believe like, oh, come on, no, this is not possible. Well, no, it is actually possible. So that's the first breakthrough, self-management. The other one we talked about is the striving for wholeness, for taking off these professional masks and showing up whole, allowing all of ourselves to come to the workplace with all of our energy and passion and enthusiasm and creativity. And that makes a hell of a difference.
And there are, excuse me, sorry to interrupt, there are processes to enable that?
Of course, yeah.
Like what?
For instance, take all of the HR processes, right? All of the HR processes as we do them today push us to wear a professional mask because, a lot of them trigger fears. For me, it's interesting, for instance, take the very first moment you interact with a new organization in the recruitment process, right? I mean, the recruitment process is where the lying typically starts, right? You will write your bio, your CV, and in there, you will try to hide some of the things that, maybe not so proud about. You try to make yourself look, right? You try to make yourself look as good as you can.
Yeah.
Right. And the organization does the same, right? Now there's like a whole domain that is called employer branding, where the organization tries to make itself sexy and uses all of the marketing tricks to make itself look sexy when it isn't, right? And then the whole recruitment process is both of these parties trying to see through the lies of the other and see like, are you really as good as you claim that you are? And so it all starts with a level of authenticity.
Yeah.
Right? And so what would it look like to do a recruitment process that skips all of that, where we're sort of radically honest, right? And what it means, for instance, a lot of these organizations and factories that operate in that way is that you actually have no HR department that is doing the recruiting. It's the actual team, on the shop floor that does its own recruitment. And, these people aren't trained to pretend that they're better than they are. They will show everything warts and all because they will have to live with you, and you will hate them if you've been hiding what you've practiced. So there's recruitment. There's how do we do performance evaluations? How do we do meetings so that in a way that we show up whole?
I think you touched on a key principle that I would encourage the audience to investigate further, which is the concept of radical transparency, radical honesty. It's part of taking off the mask, and it's been quite deeply thought out. It's like it's quite interesting.
And it would be too long to go into the details of all these practices, but just to give you one example of a super simple practice, which I think is so beautiful and powerful, is this one organization in Germany, they have a network of mental health clinics, hospitals. And in all of their meetings, they have little bells that, sit in the meeting room. And at the beginning of every meeting, there's just a question like, who's going to volunteer to have the bells this time? Okay, so let's imagine I volunteer to have the bells. I'm just a normal participant in the meeting. But whenever I feel that someone's ego is getting triggered, right? That somebody's talking from our
ego alert.
It's an ego alert, right? Like I want to, defend my team or my budget, or, I want to argue a point that is besides the point simply because I don't want to say that I was wrong or whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. I just use little bells, and these little bells go like ding, and then it take a very long time, for the ding to disappear. And in that time, everybody's just supposed to be in silence and just go back to center, sort of, and go like, just, okay, why were we getting off track and, all getting trapped up in our egos? Nice. And what is it that we really want to do in this meeting? And what I find so fascinating about this super simple practice is that people are so trained to spot, when am I getting defensive? When am I getting aggressive? When am I in my ego? That they find that they simply have meetings pretty much without egos.
Exactly. You train it out.
Now imagine. Exactly. Now you train it out. Now imagine how powerful that simple thing is. Like how many millions of bad decisions get, filtered out if we don't, talk from the ego. And it feels like such a more relaxing place when we can go into meetings where we know that the egos won't be triggered. And it's so much more productive, and it's just so much more enjoyable. And all it takes is these little bells that you can probably buy for, $5 somewhere. Mm-hmm. And amazing. I find this quite fascinating because it's, in many ways, it's extraordinarily low tech. And in many ways, it's an extraordinary breakthrough. Like I know a lot of organizations where if you were to do this, there would be no meeting, right? You would just go like ding, 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 ding all the time because the only thing that is talking is
egos. Yeah. Well, okay. I mean, that's a brilliant organizational hack right there. And especially because the ego is quite a kind of consideration in the biohacking scene, in the mindfulness scene, etc. Now, moving on to the third
breakthrough. Yeah.
Third pillar, evolutionary purpose.
Okay, this one is the hardest often to understand and to wrap our head around. In a traditional management model, the one where we look at the organization as a machine, well, a machine doesn't really have any purpose. It doesn't have any energy to do anything on its own. You have to feed it energy. You have to program it to go in a certain direction. But if you believe that the organization is a living organism, then a living organism has an energy of its own. It has something that it wants to accomplish. It has its own sense of direction. Mm-hmm. And so what that means is that for us as leaders of that organization, instead of having to do a sort of brilliant strategy and figure out where does this organization need to go and then program it in that way and then make sure that we execute a plan and that nobody steps outside of the bounds of what we've planned in terms of execution. We actually look at this organism as having its own sense of direction. And for us as leaders, we simply need to listen to where does it naturally want to go, which is a much more humble stance, but also a much more powerful stance because we're always sailing with the wind in our backs, right? We're always going where the organization is naturally meant to go. And so this comes with very sort of deep listening practices of, instead of having grand strategies, of simply listening like, what is the natural next thing for this organization? And so these are radically more participative practices that allow us to simply sail with the wind, with the energy, and make for outcomes that we couldn't even have made up in our mind with traditional strategy practices or budget practices.
Nice. And that leads in nicely to the final pillar. So you have to be able to sense and respond. And John Hagel from Deloitte Center for the Edge called it addressing unseen challenges and opportunities and building that in and being able to hear it, right?
Exactly. So the traditional management method that we've inherited from the scientific industrial revolution was the idea that we should predict and control the future. Right? That's when we make grand strategies. We see 3-5 years ahead, and then we fix everything. And then we fix everything, and now we execute a plan.
Yeah.
Right? And that can work in relatively low complexity environments. But in highly complex environments, by the moment we fix something, everything is already changing. Right? And a lot of us have had this experience in organizations where we're working to a plan, but we already feel that the plan is outdated, right? Or that there's actually so much more that we should have taken.
By the time you finish the plan, not even started.
Right? And so instead of predicting and controlling, we're constantly sensing and adjusting, right? We want everybody in the organization, so 14,000 people if they're 14,000, to constantly sense like what is happening, and to be able to channel that into changes to the plan, whatever plan we have, so that the plan is constantly updated with the latest insights, the latest knowledge, and so that the whole organism is constantly amorphously moving ahead, right? To give you a metaphor that for me illustrates that, like take a very complex ecosystem like a forest, right? A forest has like millions of living organisms, billions, going from big trees to microorganisms in the soil. Now imagine that the winter comes in much earlier than expected, right? In a traditional predict and control mechanism, the few people at the top, so imagine the largest trees, would tell everybody else, hey, stop, don't do anything. We'll think about this very hard. We'll come up with a plan. And as soon as we have our plan, we'll communicate the plan. And then you get to kick into action, right? That's how it would happen. But of course, in many cases, that's way too slow. By the time these few trees have made up a plan, the cold has already killed off most of the organisms, The way a forest adapts is by all of the organisms sensing and adapting at the same time, interacting with each other, telling each other what they're doing. And the whole adaptation, the plan is born out of all of these people working at the same time. And the interesting thing is we start to understand how to do this in organizations as well. Right? And we see that like the organizations that have adapted best to COVID weren't the organizations where they said, everybody freeze and we'll make a super plan at the top, but where the opposite happened, right? Where there were a few sense of directions, but everybody was given some degrees of freedom to start changing all sorts of things that the top could have never thought about, right? And then you have suddenly organizations that were able to do curbside delivery within 4 days instead of 12 months. That was the initial plan.
That was the initial plan, and that's a nice segue. So now I think we've kind of covered some of the key principles of reinventing organizations and your work. If we could wrap up by sharing some of the latest things that you've seen over the last few months, 2020. What's the news from the front? What's going on?
I think that COVID has been a great revelator about how broken our management system is. And that there where you've seen breakthroughs is where organizations suddenly allowed other ways of operating. There was a very interesting article in the McKinsey Quarterly that they were calling Reinventing for Speed, where they gave all of these examples of people doing curbside delivery in 4 days instead of 12 months. Mm-hmm. And all of that happened because they temporarily suspended the old management model. Mm-hmm. And allowed for some of these new ways of working. And the interesting thing is what is going to happen after COVID is, our manager is going to sigh of relief, like, oh, we can go back to this old model. Or will some of these organizations really accelerate and build entirely new foundations? So I don't think that there was anything fundamentally new that happened in the last few months. It was just a revelator of how broken the old system was, and that certain organizations suddenly felt the freedom to experiment with something different. Very
nice. Very nice. Okay, so I think we've covered things quite appropriately. Mm-hmm. Now, in parting, if you had to share one kind of idea that we might also use for a social media with the audience, if you wanted to get one message across about your work, what would that be?
A lot of what people talk about when it comes to work, automation and AI and robotics and, brain-computer interface and all of these things are often ways, I believe, to optimize a broken system. And I'm much more interested in looking at the very foundations of our management system. All of the hierarchy that we have, the bureaucracy that we have in those systems, all of the strategies and budget systems that no one really believes in anymore, but that we still do and going through the motions, and understanding that that is an outdated, broken system, and replace it with something entirely new. And then on top of that new system, that new foundation, you can unleash some new technologies. But what you'll find is that actually by going from an old, outdated system to a new system, you already reap benefits that aren't like 5% or 10% improvement, but are something where you go times 10 in terms of productivity, but also in terms of fulfillment and enjoyment and purpose.
Beautiful. Okay, well, thank you, Frederic, for the time. Thank you for sharing. We will put links to your materials as usual, and thank you.